privacy. So I think about a continuum from the most public to the most private. And as we'll see, and as you experience every day, that goes from a gate at the front of the property, through a shared landscape, through a gateway into a building, then a courtyard, etc. And in each case, it becomes more private, as you know, to your front door. Then I think about what we would describe as, this is a little jargony, a legible spatial organization. And what that means is, do the people who use the building understand it? When you walk into a building, if it's a public building, you should know where the main space is, where the main staircase is, where the public bathrooms are. That makes it legible. So in an apartment like this, pretty much anyone should, I used to, when I was teaching, would say, how will the pizza man know where to deliver the pizza? It needs to be legible, understandable. We then talk about architectural vocabulary and an architectural language. So these buildings, I would say, have a modernist architectural language, and it's a system of decisions that architects and landscape architects use so that things work together. In practice, I would say that blueberries are good, spaghetti sauce is good, but you don't put blueberries in spaghetti sauce because they have a different language, so to speak. And it's the same with buildings. There would be things you wouldn't do with a building like this because of its language. And then finally, zooming in even more to the details, to what are the windows like, how do the columns meet the ground, things like that. And last but not least, we now think about the sustainability and resilience of a building and a landscape. So that's a lot of stuff to think about, and I'm going to suggest that Peggy, Bradley, and Lisa, if you want to add anything at this point, or if we can walk toward the atrium.
Okay, should we just?
Yeah.
Everyone's in the sun right now.
Okay.
Maybe inside could be used to kind of
Inside.
That I think will be interesting. I want you all to maybe listen to this, I'll read you just a very short thing, and then tell you why I'm reading it to you. It says, a small site in a suburban area required a tower structure. A design sense desired the ground levels remain open and of a human scale. The solution was achieved by raising the tower on a base of battered piers, allowing the site to flow past lush landscaping and cantilever terraces to an open central lobby. This provides a pleasant space, cool and sheltered from sun and tropical showers. From the base rises with the structural system expressed by projecting exterior columns and massive concrete balconies cantilevered at each floor. Perimeter beams of structural floor slabs are projected to express floor lines. Apartments open to balconies through sliding doors of bronze glass used to reduce glare and provide contrast to the exposed concrete. That is not about this building, about our project here. But it was written about another condominium building built in Miami in the decade before, actually about 5 years before this building. And it was talking to the kind of Mayan influences at the time, and also this kind of emergence of a different kind of inside-outside living that we have in Florida. I thought it was interesting because we're in this space that they're talking about, but not the space that they're talking about.
So in the same way that in other fields, there's a kind of a conversation or a lineage that projects have one with another, what Bradley's describing is how this fits into that larger context. And and it has to do with the outside to inside relationship, and then as I was describing it, going from public to private in various ways. And where we are right now, you can see the outside landscape, obviously. And Peggy, I wonder if you could talk about the character of the outside landscape versus the landscaping and So, let me just point out that I think this is probably one of the most beautiful natural sites in all of Gainesville. And for those of you who may not know, it's considered to be a mesic hammock, which means moderately moist. Hydrate hammock would be wetter, a xeric hammock would be drier, but this is like the perfect place. And so I think the original designers of the landscape really did their best to take advantage of the natural amenity of the site. I think that we spent Friday afternoon walking the site with the grounds committee, and my recommendation is I think that there can be some simplifying of the outside landscape, but I think the detail of both of these atria are really quite nice. I love the massing of the plants, and it seems like over time the selection of the individual plants have proven to be successful for the most part. There's some trees here and there. But again, I think one of the values, one of the advantages of this kind of more intimate space is to really take advantage of the variation in texture. And again, I think the contrasts of the textures that have been selected in this space is really very pleasing. The one recommendation, which not all of you may agree upon, but I think that it would be better to use planters to focus a little bit of color and keep all of the permanent planters, so to speak, being more green and more this contrast in texture. And I think they've really done a nice job again with varying heights. I think we were talking the other day about maybe this does definitely need a ground cover in it to contrast with the sago palm stay. But I think some color in planters or pots would really maybe give it a little more life and possibly pick up the color of the foliage. It would be kind of interesting to have sort of orangey, reddish impatiens would be a possible suggestion. But I think there is definitely a contrast between the character of the exterior landscape and the more intimate spaces of the two atria. And anyway, I feel fortunate to be in such a beautiful place.
Yeah.
I just want to talk a little bit, just to explain a bit about what Tim is talking about in terms of the levels of privacy that are happening in this building. I really appreciate the opportunity for you all to let us talk about this. I mean, it's not a fluke that a lot of architects are interested in living here.
Right.
I know I heard about it from Chris and James, they heard about it from Vikesh, and so and then we also have colleagues who are like, as soon as the kids are out of the house, we're moving here. You know, so it is something that I know, from an architect standpoint, it's the reason I'm saying it's a great opportunity is because I do want you all to understand kind of what we do for a living, is that we're thinking about kind of every aspect of it. And so it's not just picking out paint colors and that kind of thing, but we are thinking about kind of the scales of how the building, how you experience the building. And so one thing I want to point out in terms of kind of the levels of privacy is that when you stand on the outside of the building, what you'll notice is that all the balconies have concrete coming, right? And so that concrete is basically is part of this idea of it being more solid and opaque. So that way, from oblique angles, basically, you are seeing more solid, opaque, and more privacy, right? It's not until you stand right up front that you actually see the kind of open grate, and now that becomes kind of much more public, let's say. And you see that in here also, right? Is that there is very selective moments of in front of all of our units where the kind of main hallway is perpendicular to it. It is concrete solid, right? And then these other moments here where the elevator is and other parts that are kind of more shared are the more open kind of way. And so that's really intentional in terms of thinking about those levels of privacy, right? Other details I just want to point out also is the balcony has a kind of slit cut between the balcony part and the building itself. Very intentional. and also functional. It allows you to kind of be able to drain certain things on the other side, but also it's the expression of the fact that because it is concrete, what the architect is most likely trying to do is to show that, but it's still not as fortressy. It is basically something that pulls away so that you see it as balcony and then not building kind of like,
Like a big monolith or something.
right, like
Yeah.
not like, just kind of
Yeah.
pulling out and out. So those are the kinds of like design ideas and design thinking that we're always kind of thinking about. It's the same with this kind of overhang. The overhang is a transitional threshold. Its purpose also helps with the rain and for us to drop off, but it definitely tells us that you are now entering into a new space, right? And in terms of the ideas of texture that Peggy was just talking about, for us, even noticing what the material palette is starts to also tell us that we're in a different zone, right? So the fact that there's kind of natural stone here versus brick on this side is basically telling us the two purposes of that as a kind of circulation system versus this, which is about kind of like sitting, relaxing, enjoying nature, right? Because the actual stones are a much more natural shape rather than it being cut back.
And I'll just add one more thing before we move on. As you can probably already see, we could talk amongst ourselves for several hours about the project. But just kind of maybe tying together a few things that have been mentioned. I used the term architectural vocabulary, and I said that this would be considered a modern or modernist building. And what that means is that it has a very abstract form. So if you think about like old buildings in older cities that have gargoyles or arches or things like that, there are all kinds of meanings associated with those. In the 20th century, architects and other artists wanted to strip things to their essence in a way. So Lisa talked about the overhead canopy there or the balconies here. They're very abstract. They don't have any ornaments. They essentially, in a phenomenological way, they focus you in your body and how you experience the space. So if you're on the balcony, you can see out, but others can't see you. That's its goal. And because they're so simple and so minimal, they call more attention to the things that remain. So Lisa pointed out the gaps that drain water functionally, but also they provide just a little bit of detail in the building. She also talked about the change of textures, but notice that everything here, except maybe Peggy's future impatience, is in neutral colors, right? Kind of a beige neutral, a warm neutral. So there's a difference here to here to here, but it's not a glaring difference, it's a subtle difference. And that's what the fact that the building is so, has a minimal quality to it is what allows us to see and focus on the textures that Peggy talked about, or the built textures, the surfaces that Lisa's talking about.
One other thing just to point out for you to notice as we're walking around is that in this building, in these sets of buildings, you can see that the idea of horizontality is super important, right? And that's a concept that's of the mid-century versus like in the 80s when everything was a grid. Everything was a grid, you know what I mean? So like including like the glass blocks, we saw everything. That was very kind of the next phase after mid-century. So everything that you look at, like even our windows are designed so that the panels are horizontal, right? The emphasis is horizontal, not as them as square panels. Very intentional. The fact that the floor slab is also expressed on the outside is also very intentional. And just kind of the fact that the concrete follows these kinds of horizontal lines. So that's just one thing to kind of just to look out for. That like when we're changing our windows, the reason why like we want to kind of keep that is that that's what it's emphasizing. It's the horizontality of that modernist.
Jim mentioned the lack of ornamentation of the building, the simplicity of it. And I think the same carries through not a place for fussy kinds of plants. You want masses of things that really help you find space. But the other day when we were here, we were talking particularly about this bed. And there is nothing symmetrical here, right? This is a very, very symmetrical design. Here's the site of homes in the Middle East. If it were me, I would live in here, there, and it would reinforce the lack of symmetry and for the asymmetry of the home project. So it's just an example of how a really subtle change in planting could reinforce symmetry.
And so why is asymmetry important? Is that symmetry is static. It's classical, neoclassical versus asymmetrical is about movement and dynamism.
Oh.
So that's why you want to think about that. Because the moment you put something just right in the center, it's a very static kind of composition rather than something off center, which basically now implies movement.
So maybe taking that as a cue, we should move.
Does the architecture affect your purchase of it?
No, absolutely. Yes.
How much?
Like entirely. The moment I walked in, well, first I don't know if you guys knew James and Kristen, who lived, I can't remember which one, but they taught with us also. And so they had found this place, and we came over for dinner. I came over for dinner, and I was like, what is this? I had no idea it was here. It was hidden in the trees. It's just such a beautiful layout also, in terms of it's intelligent because we only share one wall between units. And then everybody has kind of like you just basically have one real neighbor, right? And even then, our plumbing stack is in the middle, but you can't hear that neighbor at all, right? So but then also the way this is set up is really kind of, so for me, it's a very serene, relaxing environment. The moment I kind of step onto the property, onto the brick, I feel like I am home and I have peace, right? Like because of the sound, because of the vegetation, because of kind of the way this building is oriented, you always catch all kinds of breezes, no matter which direction it's coming in, right? So basically, it's just a really like, I don't think there's ever a moment in this atrium that I haven't felt like,
Yeah, right?
right? I mean,
Well, can I just say, like, to your question? So Sarah Walters, I'm Bradley's wife, and I can tell you, we had a house over by West Side Park before we moved here, and I was the one who was saying, maybe we should get rid of the yard work. Maybe we should find a condo. You know, there are a lot of condos in Gainesville, but there were only a couple that Bradley was even interested in looking at. So I was thrilled when 5E came on the market.
also very rare to find an apartment that has floor to ceiling windows.
Yeah.
Quite frankly. So that for me was also like really interesting. I know it scares my parents because it's like there's no it's so hard. But it brings so much light in and to be looking outside at the trees.
Why don't we keep walking, and as we move toward the second building, be aware that we're moving from one tower in a garden to another tower in a garden.
All in Ring Park, what's now Ring Park?
3 on the other side and the 2 on this side. There were 5 residential buildings and the club that were planned.
Thank you.
And if those 3 had been built, we would have had no park.
No park.
I'm glad they ran out of money.
So that's probably a good reminder that we should speak to that, since everybody may not understand. This was developed by Gaineswood Development Corp. It was specifically created for this project. There were 10 principal members of that development group, including Dr. Alfred Ring, who the park is named after. But there were donors in California, in Miami, in Connecticut that all contributed to the development of this property. There were 5 residential buildings planned, the 2 that were built and 3 that were never built on the other side of the creek. Building 1 we'll walk through in a few minutes, but building 1 here, and then of course building 2 that we were just in. The project was designed by Russell Melton, that's the name of the firm, out of Miami. It was if you do research on Russell Melton, those are 2 principal architects, T. Tripp Russell, I think, and Howard Melton. They practiced with different groups at different moments in time, and then they had come together to create a firm just before actually this project was built. One thing I would just point out, since we're on the side of the building where we can see some of the geometries of the overall massing, this building has both of these 2 buildings have a kind of pronounced mansard roof, this kind of sloped roof on the penthouse level. And as I was looking back at the firm, they did a pretty important project for in Miami, the Coconut Grove Library, which replaced a prior library on that site from 1901. They built that in 1963, which meant that it was a pretty close predecessor for this development. There was also a big 4-building multifamily project that they built in Miami, which probably helped them be on the radar. That was all out of concrete, which allowed them to kind of develop the skills that they would need here. But it was a bigger development. There were a series of problems during construction. In some of the lawsuits, they speak to a 30% budget, like that the budget had gone 30% over what it was anticipated to be, or a shortfall of about $3 million. And that was part of the reason that they decided to sell the property on the other side of the creek to the city, and then it was ultimately developed as the park rather than additional buildings.
So what's special about this place though, you know it's not like a typical apartment building, because basically each building is actually 3 separate buildings, right? And so part of the idea of efficiency and cost is that the more exterior wall you have, the more expensive the building is. That's why a lot of buildings are basically very tight apartment buildings right next to each other with shared walls to minimize the amount of exterior wall. Because the exterior wall is what we have to protect against water, weight, temperatures, all that stuff, basically. And so that's what costs quite a bit in a construction. So the fact that this building is mostly exterior wall is kind of amazing. I just want to point that out.
It's kind of amazing for all of us
Yeah.
who live here now. It was kind of unfortunate for the people that built it because it costs a lot more to build than other buildings that have smaller amounts of exterior wall.
A developer would have to spend more money to do something like this kind of layout, than any of our kind of typical apartment kind of buildings.
Including the new ones that are not very popular in the center of town. And the reason they look like that is because they're much, much more inexpensive to build per apartment unit, essentially. So even though I'm not a fan of a lot of things, that would be another tour, and I'm sure you all would contribute. But essentially, there is a good justification for why they look like they do. I wanted to mention a couple of things while we're here. One is the idea of apartment towers in a forest or in a garden. And in the modern West, that began in the early 20th century when Le Corbusier and others began thinking about towers and gardens. So rather than having a city with lots of, what were in the 19th century kind of desperate tenements with, of course there wasn't good sanitation and there were horses and blah, 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 blah. So when they had the opportunity, especially after wars where there were open spaces in cities, in European cities, they replaced horizontal housing on the ground plane with more vertical housing, with the idea that everyone would share the common landscape, which seems to work really well here. It doesn't always work as well. It has to be maintained. There are lots of examples of apartment complexes in that where they don't have good management, et cetera, and where a lot of desperately poor people have really tough lives. But the concept, I think one of the reasons Bradley and Lisa and all of you love this place is because this is the way it was intended to work. So, we've just walked through the forested landscape. And I just wanted to mention one other consideration that architects make when thinking about modern architecture or 20th century architecture. So, and to this day. So in the traditional architecture in the West, up until about that time, focused on very kind of rule-based formulas for how buildings would be built, and people like them for lots of reasons having to do with how understandable they are and how we can understand them from a distance as well as close up. And one of the kind of key things is, how does the building change from top to bottom? Because what happens on the ground plane is different from what happens when you, as we say, hit the sky, right? Where you touch the sky. So this is a good example of the way these architects dealt with that. As we look behind us, you can see, first of all, that in this area anyway, on the ground level, are the garages. So the housing is lifted up to the second level, which is also one of those early 20th century principles when they were trying to escape desperate streets in some cases in older European cities. So they pull the housing up to the second floor because it was safer and put other things, public spaces or common spaces or things on the first floor. So that's what happens here, and we see that the ground plane, that first ground plane, you could think of in a sense the whole first floor as a kind of a base. We see the expressed columns, we see the deeply set garage spaces. So they create a shadow, whereas the rest of the wall is much more smooth and flat, right? And that's just kind of shadow because the color is all the same. It's really just a simple layer of space that's different. And then Bradley talked about the mansard roof at the top, which is an atypical way for a modernist building to hit the sky, but it does make a top. So we see the base, the middle, and the top of this building in the same way that you would see that in a 16th century Renaissance church, for example, although the vocabulary is different.
One thing I just want to point out also is that when we build nowadays, trying to save trees is actually really difficult because of all the equipment and the sizing of things, and you have to dig into the ground. So the fact that working around existing trees that was here was significant. And also what's really interesting is that this is the perfect moment. I'm standing here and my apartment's over there, but I can't really see it, so depending on, yet at this moment I can see B wing, right? But if I then move over there, B wing becomes hidden, but then the F wing becomes more visible, right? So at any point as you move through this site, buildings are kind of covered by trees. And that's also why in our apartments, I think everyone's apartments, is that you can't really see across this way or that way to see everything, but the idea that as you kind of shift your movement, it starts to kind of allow the building to disappear into the trees and then reappear into the trees.
Everybody has trees after all.
What?
We all have a forest.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not easy to keep these trees in construction at all. Those are usually have to go away in order to do all the infrastructure. So it costs extra to keep the trees in place as you build. Yeah. So just a understanding about construction is it always goes first. And then they replant.
might be better to save this question for when we get down there, but I wanted to ask about the lake.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Should we wait till we get down there?
It's
and-
part of the landscape.
Yeah, we can like.
Let's talk down there.
Yeah.
But yes.
Yeah, so we'll walk through again and then down to the common space.
Yes. It's a great success.
Clubhouse is really intentional, right? Like here, we're basically creating a tall wall, opaque wall, to basically help guide the community into this space. So it's almost like a funneling kind of effect. Here, we can see that this is also intentionally like just a framework that also becomes a threshold transition from going from outside to now being kind of like in a foyer, basically now inside the building into the court, into the clubhouse. Sorry, I keep calling it a courtyard, but the clubhouse. So all these things, like part of this is also being able to say, okay, even when we walk that way, we see a little bit of the pool, we see the tennis court, but it's kind of guiding us into it and then bringing us into the building to see the pool and the tennis court in a different way, from straight on instead of just from like an oblique angle. So just to kind of point out some of the like intentionality of this. Like we spend so much time with our students basically kind of analyzing why things are done the way they are and what they mean. And so we don't know, we don't personally know the architects, but we can see from analyzing it what their intention was. Basically. So, sure.
And the other thing I'll mention, Lisa talked about the trellis here. Again, with that minimal language, we talked about how the balconies, in a sense, are like folded planes, a U-shaped plane that holds the balcony. And this is a large plane, and I would call these linear elements. They're kind of like lines without any detail, I mean, except for the wood itself. But now if you look back at the building we just exited, see the railings on the front, see how those linear elements, the railings too are like a smaller scale version of this. And all of the windows are similarly a small scale linear version of this. So that same vocabulary, a very minimal, simple forms is used, and the handrails and the stairways and so forth is used in different ways. And that helps to tie things together. And that's what makes it a coherent project all the way from, again, from there's a famous saying, from spoon to city, what's the scale of the design? So from the handrails to the arbor to the balconies to the walls to the stair, you can even see the stair